Welcome to episode 4 of America, Yes or No. Well, we now have two 2020 political debates under our belts, one each for president and vice president. After watching those exercises in political theater, I was really tempted to preempt this episode in order to talk about those. But after considering the nonsensical escapade that is modern political debate, I just thought it important that we first get a little farther along our journey to understanding truth, history, and the idea of thinking for ourselves. Politics can justly be summed up as the art of frightening or enticing the herd of voters in one direction or the other. We'll talk about that soon enough. Warning! This podcast contains references to religion and to God. Should at any time you feel triggered by said religious references, suffering symptoms such as reassessing long-held beliefs or being critical of current assumptions, ask your doctor if listening to America, Yes or No is right for you. Okay, that wasn't a real warning. It was supposed to be funny, but yes, we are going to discuss the concept of a supreme being in this episode on truth. Because, as I hope to explain, one doesn't fully exist without the other. All right, let's get started by asking the simple yet obvious question, the one to which mankind has been seeking a satisfactory answer for centuries. And it is simply this: what is truth? What is truth? How does one answer that? How would you answer that? Well, if we're being totally honest with ourselves, we'd probably start by responding, gee, that's a tough one. It kind of depends on, and then fill in the blank. What you already believe, what you've been taught, what's happened to you in your life, etc., etc. Now, isn't that something? Think for a moment about why it's so hard to just say what is truth. Why can't we do it? Well, I'm going to dive in here with my own feeble attempt at providing some answers to a couple of those questions we just raised. Hopefully, we can reason together in the next several minutes and find some common understanding as we move forward on our journey towards reason, historical context, and truth. I think I'd like to start the discussion by suggesting that the primary reason why it's so difficult to define truth is probably because the concept of absolute truth itself has fallen out of fashion. Now let me explain what I mean by that by asking this question. What is it, do you think, that makes a society? What binds a society together? I'll give you a hint. It's not, as we've been brainwashed to believe, diversity. It's the precise opposite of that. It's unity. Having a shared set of ideals and beliefs, a common language and culture, and so on, are precisely the things that define a society. And by society, I mean anything from an entire nation all the way down to a Boy Scout troop. So if that's the case, that unity and commonly held ideals are what create and unite a society or a nation, then logically, as unity and the sense of shared community within that nation decay, so too does the nation. Now here's another more specific question. What is it that binds and unites the American nation? We could probably debate that for a while, but may I suggest that answer must harken back to our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, the combination of which set up the very ideals and the framework of governance for our nation. It would have to be our shared ideals and our common reliance on those seminal documents that largely define who and what America is, would it not? Now, if we can agree on that point, let's go back even further. What was it that informed the creation of these two inspirational documents? I'll give you the short answer here, but I'll also encourage you to learn more about that answer in the links that I'll provide on the podcast homepage. But the short answer is that the writers of our founding documents were exceptionally intelligent and well-read persons, and what they created was informed by their lifelong studies of history, philosophy, languages, civilizations, and religion, all of which, this is where I'm going here, points to a foundation based on timeless principles and truth. Kind of the very opposite of what we hear from the woke crowd these days, eh? At this point, I want to focus on the religion aspect for a minute and how that relates to the concept of truth. Now, for the non-religious among you, I'm well aware that there are several schools of philosophical thought that do an admirable job of defining truth, and I am not here to deny the value of a philosophical understanding of truth. However, that school of thought is based almost entirely on the concept of what can be seen or quantified or proven. Now again, there's nothing wrong with that sort of analytical approach, especially as it's applied to critical thinking or problem solving. But in a sort of ironic twist to that idea, it also leads many folks to believe that only what they see or experience or understand is truth. And this can be dangerous because it eventually leads to the idea that there are varieties of the truth. Conversely, if one is disposed to believe that all truth can be traced back to one divine, omniscient source, i.e. God, then the notion that there is such a thing as absolute truth, or an absolute set of truths, lends much more weight to the very word truth itself, because it then extends well beyond only what we can see, measure, quantify, and so on. And I'll explain later why this is important. Let's talk about truth in relation to our nation's founding. If one is truly willing to objectively study it, without letting modern ideologies obstruct clear thinking, it is demonstrably evident that America was founded on the principles and timeless truths embodied in Judeo-Christian ethics, contrary to what Barack Obama and others have tried to tell us. To cite just one example, the founders' commitment to the rule of law, just one of our unique and unifying American ideals, traces its origins back to English common law, which itself traces back to the concept of written law in general, which, by the way, was not always historically practiced. Can you imagine not having laws written down somewhere? And if you go back far enough, the concept of written law itself traces back to, of all things, Mosaic law, as in Moses the lawgiver, as in the Ten Commandments. Recall that after Moses led the Hebrew host out of Egyptian captivity, he was given these and a slew of other lesser-known Old Testament laws to try to effectively govern and manage millions of recently freed slaves. Yep, American law, which descends from Anglo-Saxon law, can be traced all the way back to Mosaic law. There is ample evidence in both the founders' writings as well as in our governing documents that the majority of them knew of and subscribed to these ancient but revered beliefs. And it wasn't just because they were a bunch of old, out-of-date white guys either. It was because they knew through their extensive studies that these truths and principles worked, that they were as timeless as they are praiseworthy. So, whether or not we want to admit it today, the concepts of written law, of ethics, and of right and wrong all have their origins in religious belief, in the concept of a supreme creator and judge. And that's not just a Western construct either. Many Eastern religious philosophies trace their foundings back to, if not deity per se, then at least to a great spiritual philosopher of some type. Now, once again, this is not intended to deny the value of philosophical truth. The founders understood and cited many of the world's great philosophers in public statements and in their own published works. I think I'm just trying to point out that denying the influence of religious thought as part of our American foundation is just not supported by the historical facts. And again, I encourage you to research this for yourself. My point is this. Truth is not a pliable, standalone word. It stems from the larger notion that there is overarching absolute truth, which itself implies that there exists an author and arbiter of absolute right and wrong, otherwise known as truth. Now, as individuals and societies distance themselves from religion and from the notion of a supreme being, as we and much of the world have been doing for decades, then the idea that there is such a thing as absolute truth also begins to fade. Sure, it's possible to believe in American ideals and to be a good American without necessarily believing in God. But as we actively deny the essential role that religious belief has played in the formation of our commonly held ideals, we risk becoming untethered not only from truth, but we also begin to deny the very concept that there is truth to be had. That, as we learned earlier, opens us up to the notion that there are versions of the truth, which immediately torpedoes the significance of the word itself. One of the more malignant manifestations of this no real truth phenomenon is that we begin replacing right and wrong with the notion of whatever feels right to me or to my group. This is known as moral relativism, the idea that only I can know what's right for me. Politically, moral relativism manifests itself as us questioning, as we are today, the very foundational history of our own country. As we drift further and further from historical truth, we begin to see, as we are today, the advent of multitudes of social and political philosophies. Many of these ideas, playing on the notion that there is no truth, or that God has no place in government or society, espouse the view that it is actually the state, meaning a centrally controlled form of government, rather than deity, or God, that should be the final arbiter of right and wrong. And are we not seeing much of this today also? One of the problems with that, as we learned in our previous episode, is that a giant, all-powerful government cannot be trusted to act in our best interest, but instead can be counted on to do precisely what furthers its own interest. Recall the following. 1. Career politicians desire only to obtain and exercise more and more power. 2. As government power increases, individual liberty shrinks. And 3. The government that is powerful enough to give you everything you want is also powerful enough to take away everything that you have. Okay, we did diverge a bit here from our discussion of truth, but I believe that that was necessary to illustrate why it has become so difficult for us, individually and collectively, to understand and define what is truth. Moral relativism and political correctness are blurring its clear definition. The mom who tells her child, "Oh, of course you're special, honey, everybody's special," is inadvertently teaching her child that no one is special, because the word special now has no real meaning. Similarly, if everyone has their own version of truth, then there really is no truth, is there? Words should mean things, people. We cannot allow moral decay or corrupt politicians to redefine words to suit nefarious purposes. And when referring to the word truth, by definition, that word must be reserved to things that are not subject to interpretation or opinion. So, getting back to truth, what is it? How do we define it, and how do we recognize it? Well, as with much of our speech lately, it's become very difficult to find a definition for truth that is meaningful and accurate. But here's one that I found that I think is both. Truth is knowledge of things as they are, and as they were, and as they are to come. With that in mind, in answer to my questions of what is truth and how do we recognize it, I would have to say that finding truth is not easy, and nor should it be. Truth has to be researched. We have to want it. We have to seek after it, and we have to weigh it. and compare it against various sources. That is very important. Truth always has corroborating sources. As an example, I've mentioned my abiding interest in World War II, right? Well, over the years, I must have read literally hundreds of books and first-person accounts and watched hours and hours of documentaries, to the point where I'm now supremely confident in my knowledge of those events. And I am confident precisely because of the corroborating evidence between those multiple sources. That is a great way of obtaining truth. Now, as we search for truth, we have to study and take time to think and ponder. We have to be willing, if our study and corroborating evidence leads us there, to maybe reconsider things we once thought to be true. With regard to political truth, for example, I dare say that just a couple hours worth of actual research and study of our founding documents would be more than enough for you to begin seeing through the lies and the hyperbole and the false narratives about our country and its history that modern media and career politicians continually subject us to. If we are truly seeking truth, then the one place it will not be found is from either of those sources. Their only interest is in keeping you and I either dependent on them or glued to their broadcasts. Now, I'm making a leap here, but if you're looking for my advice, here are what I think are some keys to finding truth. Now, these may sound trite or overly simplistic, and you may wonder how some of them can actually help, but I'm sharing them because I've found them to work. Here they are. Live a good life. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Be humble. Be willing to learn. Put in the effort. Start by obtaining and reading our nation's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. They're not hard to find and a lot easier to read than you may think. Open your mind. Don't be so fixed on your favorite ideology. Remember that ideologies are the enemy of reason. Ask questions. And don't be afraid of the answers that you might receive. Learn how to respectfully challenge and question those with whom you disagree. This can be one of the best ways to expand your own understanding as well as to effectively defend what you know. Finally, find some quiet time to ponder and consider what you're learning. During those quiet moments, you may even consider asking God in prayer to help you find the truth and to help you recognize it when you do find it. God is not the author of confusion, and He very much wants us to come to a knowledge of truth, both spiritual as well as temporal. The fact of the matter is that all truth, all real truth, can be fit together into a great whole. And ideas that don't seem to fit into that greater whole, we may want to consider questioning and perhaps discarding. In my preface to these podcasts, I mentioned that this journey may require you to reassess your long-held political ideologies or to be critical of current assumptions, and that you may be asked to replace feelings with logic, or to let reason and historical context supersede conventional wisdom. Do not be afraid of these things. It's been difficult for me to go down this road, and I know how tough it is when you realize that things you used to consider true turn out not to be. But here's a final truth that I know for certain. Unless we can all learn to seek truth out, rather than just accept the narratives that we're constantly being fed, we are finished as a nation. Establishment politicians and the media outlets have entirely abandoned any commitment to the truth. They routinely repeat the most outrageous lies because their only goal is, how did we say it earlier, to frighten or entice the herd in one direction or the other. Is that really how you want to live your life? To be led around by the nose, deceived and taken for granted by ruling elites who don't even know you from a hole in the ground? I say no. And I truly hope that you are still willing to undertake this journey with me as we seek to sort through deception and ideological rigidity and get down to solid truth and valid principles. So if you're still on board to this point, then please tune in next time when we'll begin exploring what I consider some essential truths. Until then, please, think for yourself.